The Story of Civilization, Volume 5, The Renaissance, Part 2, by Will Durant. Continued, Cassette 9, Side 2. Of the victorious mob, half were Germans, of whom most had been convinced that the popes and cardinals were thieves, and that the wealth of the Church in Rome was a theft from the nations and a scandal to the world. To reduce this scandal, they seized all movable ecclesiastical valuables, including sacred vessels and works of art, and carried them off for melting or ransom or sale. Relics, however, they left scattered on the floor. One soldier dressed himself as a pope, others put on cardinals' hats and kissed his feet. A crowd at the Vatican proclaimed Luther pope. The Lutherans among the invaders took a special delight in robbing cardinals, exacting high ransoms from them as the price of their lives, and teaching them new rituals. Some cardinals, says Guicciardini, were set upon scrubby beasts, riding with their faces backward in the habits and ensigns of their dignity, and were led about all Rome with the greatest derision and contempt. Some, unable to raise all the ransom demanded, were so tortured that they died there and then, or within a few days. One cardinal was lowered into a grave and was told that he would be buried alive unless ransom were brought within a stated time. It came at the last moment. Spanish and German cardinals, who thought themselves safe from their own countrymen, were treated like the rest. Nuns and respectable women were violated in situ, or were carried off to promiscuous brutality in the various shelters of the horde. Women were assaulted before the eyes of their husbands or fathers. Many young women, despondent after being raped, drowned themselves in the Tiber. The destruction of books, archives, and art was immense. Philibert, Prince of Orange, who had succeeded to the quasi-command of the undisciplined horde, saved the Vatican Library by making it his headquarters, but many monastic and private libraries went up in flames, and many precious manuscripts disappeared. The University of Rome was ransacked, and its staff was scattered. The scholar Colocci saw his house burned to the ground with his collections of manuscripts and art. Baldus, a professor, saw his newly written commentary on Pliny used to light a campfire for the pillagers. The poet Moroni lost his poems, but was comparatively fortunate. The poet Paolo Bombazzi was killed. The scholar Cristoforo Marcello was tortured by having one fingernail after another pulled out. The scholars Francesco Fortuno and Juan Valdés slew themselves in despair. The artists Perino del Vaga, Marcantonio Raimondi, and many others were tortured and robbed of all that they had. The school of Raphael was finally dispersed. The number of deaths cannot be calculated. 2,000 corpses were thrown into the Tiber from the Vatican side of Rome. 9,800 dead were buried. There were unquestionably many more fatalities. A low estimate places the thefts at over 1 million ducats, the ransoms at 3 million. Clement judged the total loss at 10 million ducats, or $125 million. The sack lasted 8 days, while Clement looked on from the towers of Sant'Angelo. He cried out to God like tortured Job, "Why didst thou take me out of the womb? Would that I had been consumed, that no eye had seen me." He ceased to shave and never shaved again. He remained a prisoner in the castle from May 6th to December 7th, 1527, hoping that rescue would come from the army of the Duke of Urbino, or from Francis I, or Henry VIII. Charles, still in Spain, was glad to hear that Rome had been taken, but was shocked when he heard of the savagery of the sack. He disclaimed responsibility for the excesses, but took full advantage of the Pope's helplessness. On June 6th, his representatives, possibly without his knowledge, compelled Clement to sign a humiliating peace. The Pope agreed to pay over to them and the imperialist army 400,000 ducats, to surrender to Charles the cities of Piacenza, Parma, and Modena, and the castles of Ostia, Civitavecchia, Civita Castellana, and Sant'Angelo itself. He was to remain a prisoner there until the first 150,000 ducats had been delivered, and was then to be removed to Gaeta or Naples until Charles should determine what to do with him. All those in Sant'Angelo were allowed to depart except Clement and the 13 cardinals who had accompanied him. Spanish and German soldiers were put in charge of the castle, and kept the Pope nearly always confined in a narrow apartment. "They have not left him 10 scudi worth of property," wrote Guicciardini on June 21st. All the silver and gold that he had salvaged in his flight was surrendered to his captors, to make up 100,000 ducats of his ransom. In the meantime, Alfonso of Ferrara seized Reggio and Modena, to which Ferrara had age-long rights. and Venice took Ravenna. Florence expelled the Medici a third time and proclaimed Jesus Christ king of the new republic. The whole edifice of the papacy, material and spiritual, seemed to be collapsing into a tragic ruin that awoke the pity even of those who felt that some punishment was deserved by the infidelities of Clement, the sins of the papacy, the greed and corruption of the Curia, the luxury of the hierarchy, and the iniquity of Rome. Sadoleto, peaceful in Carpentras, heard with horror of Rome's fall, and mourned the passing of those halcyon days when Bembo and Castiglione and Isabella, and 100 scholars and poets and patrons, had made the wicked city the home and summit of the thought and art of the age. And Erasmus wrote to Sadoleto, "Rome was not alone the shrine of the Christian faith, the nurse of noble souls and the abode of the muses, but the mother of nations. To how many was she not dearer and sweeter and more precious than their own land? In truth, this is not the ruin of one city, but of the whole world." 8. Charles Triumphant, 1527 to 1530. Plague had visited Rome in 1522 and had reduced its population to 55,000. Murder, suicide, and flight must have reduced it below 40,000 in 1527. Now, in July of that year, plague came back in the full heat of summer and joined with famine and the continued presence of the ravaging horde to make Rome a city of horror, terror, and desolation. Churches and streets were littered anew with corpses. Many of these were left to rot in the sun. The stench was so strong that the jailers and prisoners fled from the castle parapets to their rooms. Even there many died of the infection, among them some servants of the Pope. The impartial plague struck the invaders, too. 2,500 Germans in Rome died by July 22, 1527, and malaria, syphilis, and malnutrition cut the horde in half. The opponents of Charles began seriously to think of rescuing the Pope. Henry VIII, fearing that an imprisoned pontiff might not grant him a divorce from Catherine of Aragon, sent Cardinal Wolsey to France to confer with Francis on measures to liberate Clement. Early in August, the two kings offered Charles peace and 2 million ducats on condition that the Pope and the French princes should be freed, and that the Papal States should be restored to the Church. Charles refused. By the Treaty of Amiens, on August 18th, Henry and Francis pledged themselves to war against Charles. Soon, Venice and Florence joined this new league. French forces captured Genoa and Pavia, and sacked the latter city almost as thoroughly as the imperialist army had sacked Rome. Mantua and Ferrara, dreading the present French more than the distant Charles, now joined the league. Nevertheless, Lautrec, the French commander, unable to pay his troops, dared not march upon Rome. The emperor, hoping to restore his grace in Catholic Christendom and to cool the ardor of the growing league, agreed to release the Pope, on condition that Clement should give no aid to the league, should at once pay the imperialist army in Rome 112,000 ducats, and should give hostages for his good behavior. Clement raised the money by selling red hats and by granting the emperor a tenth of ecclesiastical revenues in the kingdom of Naples. On December 7th, after 7 months of confinement, Clement left Sant'Angelo, and disguised as a servant, made his way humbly out of Rome to Orvieto, apparently a broken man. At Orvieto he was lodged in a dilapidated palace whose roof had caved in, whose walls were bare and cracked, whose floors admitted 100 drafts. English ambassadors, visiting him to get Henry a divorce, found him huddled in bed, his pale, emaciated face half lost in a long and unkempt beard. He spent the winter there, and then moved to Viterbo. On February 17th, the imperialist horde, having received from Clement all that he could pay, and fearing further decimation by disease, evacuated Rome and moved south to Naples. Lautrec now brought his army down with hope of besieging Naples, but his own troops were thinned out by malaria, he himself died, and his disordered forces retreated to the north on August 29, 1528. Losing all hope of aid from the League, Clement offered his full surrender to Charles, and on October 6th he was allowed to re-enter Rome. 4/5 of the houses had been abandoned, thousands of buildings were in ruins. Men were amazed to see what 9 months of invasion had done to the capital of Christendom. Charles seems to have thought for a while of deposing Clement, annexing the Papal States to the Kingdom of Naples, making Rome the seat of his empire, and reducing the Pope to his primeval role as Bishop of Rome and subject to the Emperor. But this would drive Charles into the arms of the Lutherans in Germany, would court civil war in Spain, and would arouse France, England, Poland, and Hungary to resist him with their full and united power. He abandoned the scheme and turned to the idea of making the papacy his dependent ally and spiritual aid in dividing Italy between them. By the Treaty of Barcelona on June 29, 1529, he made substantial concessions to the Pope. The principalities taken from the Church were to be restored. The Medici relatives of the Pope were to be re-established in Florence by diplomacy or force. Even Ferrara was now promised to the Pope. In return, the Pope agreed to give Charles the formal investiture of Naples, to allow the imperial armies free passage through the Papal States, and to meet the Emperor at Bologna in the following year to settle between them the peace and organization of Italy. Shortly thereafter, Margaret, aunt of Charles and regent of the Netherlands, met with Louise of Savoy, mother of Francis, and, with the aid of various ambassadors and legates, formulated the Treaty of Cambrai on August 3, 1529, between Emperor and King. Charles released the French princes for a ransom of 1,200,000 ducats. Francis renounced for France all claims to Italy, Flanders, Artois, Arras, and Tournai. The allies of France and Italy were left to the mercy of the Emperor. Charles and Clement met at Bologna on November 5, 1529, each now convinced that he needed the other. Strange to say, this was Charles's first visit to Italy. He had conquered it before seeing it. When he knelt before the Pope at Bologna and kissed the foot of the man whom he had dragged in the dust, it was the first time that these two figures, the one representing the Church in decline, the other the rising and here victorious modern state, had ever seen each other. Clement swallowed all pride, forgave all offenses. He had to. He could no longer look to France. Charles had irresistible armies in both southern and northern Italy. Florence could not be recovered for the Medici without imperial troops. The aid of the empire was needed against Luther in Germany, against Suleiman in the east. Charles was generous and prudent. He kept essentially to the terms of the Barcelona agreement made when he was not so unchallengeably strong. He forced Venice to restore all that she had taken from the Papal States. He allowed Francesco Maria Sforza, on paying a large indemnity, to keep ruined Milan under imperial watching, and he persuaded Clement to allow the cowardly or faithless Francesco Maria della Rovere to keep Urbino. He forgave Alfonso his recent association with France and rewarded him for aiding the march on Rome by letting him retain his duchy as a papal fief and giving him Modena and Reggio as imperial fiefs. In return, Alfonso paid the Pope 100,000 badly needed ducats. To consolidate these settlements, Charles summoned all the principalities to join in a union of Italy for common defense against foreign attack, except by Charles. That unity for which Dante had pled to the Emperor Henry VII and Petrarch to the Emperor Charles IV was now achieved through united subjection to a foreign power. Clement blessed it all and crowned Charles Emperor with the Iron Crown of Lombardy and the Imperial Papal Crown of the Holy Roman Empire, February 22nd to 24th, 1530. The alliance of Pope and Emperor was sealed with Florentine blood. Resolved to restore his family to power, Clement paid 70,000 ducats to Philibert, Prince of Orange, who had kept him prisoner, to organize an army and overturn the republic of rich men that had been set up there in 1527. Philibert sent on this mission 20,000 German and Spanish troops, many of whom had shared in the sack of Rome. In December 1529, this force occupied Pistoia and Prato and laid siege to Florence. To expose the assailants to Florentine artillery, the resolute burghers destroyed every house, garden, and wall for a mile around the city fortifications. And Michelangelo left his sculpture of the Medici tombs to build or rebuild the ramparts and forts. The siege continued mercilessly for 8 months. Food became so scarce in Florence that cats and rats brought some $12.50 apiece. Churches surrendered their vessels, citizens their plate, women their jewelry, to be transformed into money for provisions or arms. Patriotic monks like Fra Benedetto da Foiano kept up the spirit of the people with fiery sermons. A courageous Florentine, Francesco Ferrucci, escaped from the city, organized a force of 3,000 men, and attacked the besiegers. He was defeated with the loss of 2,000 of his soldiers. He himself was captured and brought before Fabrizio Marimaldi, a Calabrian who commanded the imperial cavalry. Marimaldi had Ferrucci held helpless before him, while he repeatedly drove a poignard into him until the hero died. Meanwhile, the general whom Florence had hired to lead its defense, Malatesta Barioni, entered into a treacherous agreement with the besiegers. He let them into the city and turned his guns upon the Florentines. starving and disorganized, the Republic surrendered on August 12, 1530. Alessandro de' Medici became Duke of Florence and disgraced his family by his rapacity and cruelty. Hundreds of those who had fought for the Republic were tortured, exiled, or slain. Fra Benedetto was sent to Clement, who ordered him imprisoned in Sant'Angelo. There, said an uncertain report, the monk was starved to death. The signory was disbanded. The Palazzo della Signoria now began to be called Palazzo Vecchio, and the great 11-ton bell, La Vacca, the cow, that had from the lovely tower called so many generations to Parlamento, was taken down and broken to pieces, in order, said a contemporary diarist, that we should no more hear the sweet sound of liberty. 9. Clement VII and the Arts. The Pope's treatment of Florence confirmed the degeneration of the Medici. His efforts to restore Rome revealed a spark of the administrative genius and aesthetic appreciation that had made the family great. Sebastiano del Piombo, who had portrayed him in maturity, painted him now as an old man, somber, deep-eyed, white-bearded, giving benediction. Apparently suffering had chastened and in some measure strengthened him. He took vigorous action to protect Italy from the Turkish fleets that now commanded the eastern Mediterranean. He fortified Ancona, Ascoli, and Fano, and paid the costs by persuading the consistory of June 21, 1532, over the opposition of the cardinals, to impose a levy of 50% upon the incomes of the Italian clergy, including the cardinals. Partly by selling ecclesiastical offices, he raised funds to rebuild the property of the Church, to restore the University of Rome, and to resume the patronage of scholarship and art. He took measures to ensure a proper supply of grain, despite the raids of Barbary pirates upon shipping near Sicily. In a remarkably short time, Rome was functioning again as the capital of the Western world. The city was still rich in artists. Caradossa had come from Milan, Cellini from Florence, to raise the art of the goldsmith to its Renaissance zenith. They and many more were kept busy making gold roses and swords of honor as papal gifts, vessels for the altars, silver staffs for church authorities and processions, seals for cardinals, tiaras and rings for the popes. Valerio Belli of Vicenza made for Clement a magnificent casket of rock crystal, engraved with scenes from the life of Christ. This, now one of the most precious objects in the Pitti Palace, was presented to Francis I at the marriage of his son to Catherine de' Medici. The decoration of the Vatican stanze had been resumed in 1526. The greatest painting of Clement's pontificate was done in the Hall of Constantine. There Giulio Romano pictured the apparition of the cross and the Battle of the Milvian Bridge. Francesco Penni painted the baptism of Constantine, and Raffaello del Colle portrayed Rome presented to Pope Sylvester by Constantine. After Michelangelo, and now that Giulio Romano had migrated to Mantua, the ablest painter in Rome was Sebastiano Luciano, who acquired his sobriquet del Piombo when he was appointed keeper and designer of the papal seals in 1531. Born in Venice, circa 1485, he had the luck to be taught by Gian Bellini, Giorgione, and Cima. One of his earliest and finest pictures, The Three Ages of Man, shows him as a delectable youth between two famous foreign composers then in Venice, Jacob Obrecht and Philippe Verdelot. For the church of San Giovanni Crisostomo, he painted, or finished for Giorgione, a vivid representation of that saint in the fever of composition. And about the same time, in 1510, he copied Giorgione's most voluptuous manner in a Venus and Adonis, whose generous women seemed to belong to a golden age before the birth of sin. Probably in Venice also, Sebastiano painted his renowned Portrait of a Lady, long ascribed to Raphael as La Fornarina. In 1511, Agostino Chigi invited Sebastiano to come to Rome and help adorn the Villa Chigi. There the young artist met Raphael, and for a time imitated his style of pagan ornament. In return, he taught Raphael the Venetian secrets of warm coloring. Soon Sebastiano became a devoted friend of Michelangelo, imbibed the Titan's muscular conception of man, and announced the aim of wedding Venetian color to Michelangelesque design. He had a chance to do this when Cardinal Giulio de' Medici asked him for a picture. Sebastiano chose as his subject the raising of Lazarus, in deliberate competition with the Transfiguration that Raphael was painting at that time in 1518. Critics did not unanimously contradict his judgment that he had equaled Leo's favorite. He might have progressed further had he not been too readily content with his excellence. A passion for leisure kept him this side of genius. He was a jovial fellow who could not see why one should wear himself out, either for superfluous gold or for such a will-o'-the-wisp as posthumous fame. After he had received his sinecure in the Vatican from his patron-made Pope, he confined himself for the most part to portraits, in which few painters have surpassed him. Baldassare Peruzzi was more ambitious and made his sonorous name ring for a generation across the mountains of Italy. He was the son of a weaver. Artists are mostly of lowly stock. The middle classes seek utility first, hoping to have time for beauty in their senility. Aristocrats, though they nourish art, prefer the art of life to the life of art. Born in Siena in 1481, Baldassare learned painting under Sodoma and Pinturicchio, and soon went off to Rome. Apparently it was he who painted the ceiling of the Stanza dell'Odoro in the Vatican, and Raphael thought the work good enough to leave much of it unchanged. Meanwhile, like Bramante, he fell in love with the classic ruins, measured the ground plans of the ancient temples and palaces, and studied the diverse forms and arrangements of columns and capitals. He became a specialist in the application of perspective to architecture. When Agostino Chigi decided to build the Villa Chigi, Peruzzi was invited to design it in 1508. The banker was pleased with the result, the stately crowning of a Renaissance facade with classic moldings and cornices. And finding that Peruzzi could also paint, he gave the young artist freedom to decorate several rooms of the interior in competition with Sebastiano del Piombo and Raphael. In the entrance hall and the loggia, Baldassare pictured Venus combing her hair, Leda and her swan, Europa and her bull, Danae and her golden shower, Ganymede and his eagle, and other scenes calculated to raise the tired moneylender from the prose of his days to the poetry of his dreams. Peruzzi set off his frescoes with borders painted in such tricks of perspective that Titian thought them to be veritable reliefs in stone. In the hall of the upper floor, Baldassare made illusory architecture with his brush. Cornices sustained by pictured caryatids, friezes supported by pictured pilasters, mimic windows opening upon pictured fields. Peruzzi had fallen in love with architecture and made painting its handmaid, obeying all the builder's rules, but spiritless. Let us make an exception here for the biblical scenes that he painted in a semi-dome of Santa Maria della Pace in 1517, where Raphael had painted Sibyls 3 years before. Baldassare's frescoes stood the comparison well, for these are his finest paintings, while Raphael's there were not his best. Leo X must have been impressed by Peruzzi's versatility, for he appointed him to succeed Raphael as chief architect at St. Peter's in 1520, and engaged him to paint the scenery for Bibbieni's comedy La Calandra in 1521. All that remains of Peruzzi's work on San Pietro is the ground plan that he drew. Symonds pronounced it by far the most beautiful and interesting of those laid down for St. Peter's. Leo's death and the accession of a pope allergic to art drove Peruzzi back to Siena, then to Bologna. There he designed the lovely Palazzo Albergati and made a model for the never-finished facade of San Petronio. He hurried back to Rome when Clement VII reopened the Paradise of the Arts and resumed his work at St. Peter's. He was still there when the imperial mob sacked Rome. He suffered special tribulations, says Vasari, because he was grave and noble of aspect, and they thought him some great prelate in disguise. They held him for a lordly ransom, but when he proved his lowly status by painting a masterly portrait, they contented themselves with taking from him all but the shirt on his back and let him go. He made his way to Siena and arrived there almost naked. The Sienese government, proud to recapture its prodigal son, engaged him to design fortifications, and the church of Fonte Giusta commissioned him to paint a mural which was acclaimed by generous critics as his chef-d'oeuvre, a Sibyl announcing to a frightened Augustus the coming birth of Christ. But Peruzzi's greatest success was the Palazzo Massimi delle Colonne, which he designed on his return to Rome in 1530. The Massimi claimed descent and derived their name from Fabius Maximus, who had earned immortality by idling. They took their surname from the columned porch of their previous dwelling, which had been destroyed in the sack. It was Peruzzi's good fortune that the curved irregularity of the site forbade the usual dreary rectangular plan. He chose an oval form with a Renaissance facade and a Doric portico, and while keeping the exterior simple, he gave the interior all the ornament and splendor of a Roman palace of imperial days, with Greek refinements of proportion and decoration. Despite his multiform ability, Peruzzi died poor, not having had the heart to haggle with popes, cardinals, and bankers for fees commensurate with his skill. When Pope Paul III heard that he was dying, he bethought himself that only Peruzzi and Michelangelo remained to raise St. Peter's from walls to dome. He sent the artist 100 crowns, or about $1,250. Baldassare thanked him and died nevertheless at the age of 54 in 1535. Vasari, after suggesting that a rival had poisoned him, relates that all the painters, sculptors, and architects in Rome followed his body to the grave. 10. Michelangelo and Clement VII, 1520 to 1534. It is one of the credits in Clement's account that through all his own misfortunes he bore with kindly patience the moods and revolts of Michelangelo, plied him with commissions, and accorded him all the privileges of genius. "When Buonarroti comes to see me," he said, "I always take a seat and bid him be seated, feeling sure that he will do so without leave." Even before becoming pope, he proposed in 1519 what proved to be the artist's culminating sculptural assignment: to add to the Church of San Lorenzo in Florence a new sacristy as a mausoleum for famous Medici, to design their tombs and to adorn these with appropriate statuary. Confident in the Titan's versatility, Clement also asked him to draw up architectural plans for the Laurentian Library, strong and spacious enough to safely house the literary collections of the Medici family. The stately stairway and pillared vestibule of this Biblioteca Laurentiana were completed from 1526 to 1527 under Angelo's supervision. The remainder of the building was later put up by Vasari and others from Buonarroti's designs. The Nuova Sagrestia was hardly an architectural masterpiece. It was planned as a simple quadrangle, divided with pilasters and surmounted by a modest dome. Its prime function was to receive statuary in the recesses left in the walls. This Medici chapel was finished in 1524, and in 1525 Angelo began work on the tombs. Clement wrote to him in the latter year a gently impatient letter. "Thou knowest that popes have no long life, and we cannot yearn more than we do to behold the chapel with the tombs of our kinsmen, or at any rate to hear that it is finished. And likewise as regards the library. Wherefore we recommend both to thy diligence. Meanwhile we will betake us, in accord with your words, to a wholesome patience, praying God that he may put it into thy heart to push the whole enterprise forward together. Fear not that either commissions or rewards shall fail thee while we live. Farewell, with God's blessing and ours, Giulio." There were to be 6 tombs, for Lorenzo the Magnificent, his assassinated brother Giuliano, Leo X, Clement VII, the younger Giuliano, too good to govern a state, who died in 1516, and the younger Lorenzo, Duke of Urbino, who died in 1519. Only the tombs of the last 2 were completed, and even these not quite. Nevertheless, they are the apogee of Renaissance sculpture, as the Sistine Chapel is the summit of Renaissance painting, and St. Peter's Dome is the architectural pinnacle of the Renaissance. The tombs showed the dead men in the prime of life, with no attempt to reproduce their real forms or features. Giuliano in the garb of a Roman commander, Lorenzo as Il Penseroso, the thinker. When some incautious observer remarked this lack of realism, Michelangelo answered with words that revealed his sublime confidence in his artistic immortality. "Who will care 1,000 years hence whether these are their features or not?" Reclining on the sarcophagus of Giuliano are 2 nude figures. At the right, a man allegedly symbolizing day; at the left, a woman supposedly representing night. Similar recumbent figures on the tomb of Lorenzo have been named Twilight and Dawn. These interpretations are hypothetical, perhaps fanciful. Probably the sculptor's aim was merely to carve again his secret fetish, the human body, in all the splendor of male strength and all the comely contours of the female form. As usual, he succeeded better with the male. The unfinished figure of Twilight, slowly surrendering an active and exhausting day to night, matches the noblest gods of the Parthenon. War intervened upon art. When Rome fell to the Landsknechte in 1527, Clement could no longer play patron, and Michelangelo's papal pension of 50 crowns, or $625 a month, ceased. Meanwhile, Florence enjoyed 2 years of Republican liberty. When Clement made up with Charles, and the German-Spanish army was dispatched to overthrow the Republic and reinstall the Medici, Florence appointed Angelo, on April 6, 1529, to a committee of 9, Nove di Milizia, for the defense of the city. The Medicean artist became, by the hazard of circumstance, the anti-Medicean engineer feverishly engaged in designing and building forts and walls. But as these works proceeded, Michelangelo became more and more convinced that the city could not be successfully defended. What single town, divided as Florence then was in heart and loyalties, could withstand the artillery and excommunications of empire and papacy combined? On September 21st, 1529, in a mood of panic, he fled from Florence, hoping to escape to France and its amiable king. Finding his way blocked by German-held terrain, he took temporary refuge in Ferrara, then in Venice. Thence he sent a message to his friend Battista della Palla, art agent of Francis I in Florence. Would he join Angelo in flight to France? Battista refused to leave the post that had been assigned to him in the defense of the city. Instead, he wrote to Angelo a stirring appeal to return to his duty, warning him that otherwise the government would confiscate his property, leaving his impecunious relatives destitute. About November 20th, the artist was back at his work on the Florentine fortifications. According to Vasari, he found time, even in those excited months, to continue work secretly on the tombs of the Medici, and also to paint, for Alfonso of Ferrara, the least characteristic of his works, Leda and the Swan. It was a strange product for a man so slightly sexual and so generally Puritan, and perhaps it came from a temporarily disordered mind. It showed the Swan copulating with Leda. Alfonso was something of a lecher between wars, but apparently he had not chosen the subject. The messenger whom he sent to secure the promised work expressed disappointment when he saw it, saying, "This is a mere trifle," and made no effort to secure it for the Duke. Angelo gave the picture to his servant, Antonio Mini, who took it with him to France, where it passed into the collection of the omnivorous Francis I. It remained at Fontainebleau until the reign of Louis XIII, when a high official ordered it destroyed because of its indecency. How far this order was carried out and what was the later history of this original is unknown. A copy remains in the vaults of the London National Gallery. When Florence fell to the returning Medici, Battista della Palla and other Republican leaders were put to death. Michelangelo hid himself for 2 months in the house of a friend, expecting at any moment a like fate. But Clement thought him worth more alive than dead. The Pope wrote to his ruling relatives in Florence, bidding them seek out the artist, treat him with courtesy, and offer him the renewal of his pension if he would resume work on the tombs. Michael agreed. But again, as with the mausoleum of Julius, the mind of pontiff and artist had conceived more than the hand could execute, and the Pope could not live long enough to see the enterprise through. When Clement died in 1534, Michelangelo, fearful that Alessandro de' Medici would do him harm now that his protector was gone, took the first opportunity to slip off to Rome. A profound and somber sadness marks the tombs, and the solemn Madonna de' Medici that Angelo also carved for the sacristy. Historians fond of democracy, and exaggerating its scope in Florence, have generally assumed that the recumbent figures symbolize a city mourning its forced surrender to tyranny. But this interpretation is probably fanciful. After all, they had been designed while the Medici ruled Florence reasonably well. They had been carved for a Medici pope unfailingly kind to Angelo, and by an artist indebted to Medici from his youth. It is not clear that he intended to condemn the family whose tombs he was preparing, and his representations of Giuliano and Lorenzo have nothing derogatory about them. No, these figures express something deeper than the love of liberty by the rich few to rule the poor unhindered by a Medici house usually popular with the people. They express rather Michelangelo's weariness with life, the fatigue of a man all nerves and titanic uncompassable dreams, who found himself buffeted by 1,000 tribulations, harassed in almost every enterprise by the dull recalcitrance of matter, the obtuseness of power, and the called-in loans of borrowed time. Angelo had enjoyed but few of life's delights. He had no friends on a par with his mind. Woman seemed to him only a smooth anatomy threatening peace, and even his most majestic triumphs were the issues of exhausting toil and pain, the unfinishable symphonies of melancholy meditation and inescapable defeat. But when Florence had fallen to her worst tyrants, and terror ruled where once Lorenzo had governed happily, the artist who had carved a criticism of life, and no mere theory of government in the marbles of the Medici shrine, felt that those melancholy figures expressed as well the glory gone of the city that had nursed the Renaissance. On the unveiling of the Statue of Night, the poet Giambattista Strozzi wrote a quatrain of literary exposition. The night thou seest here, posed gracefully in active slumber, was by an angel wrought out of this stone. Sleeping with life she's fraught. Wake her, incredulous wight, she'll speak to thee. Michelangelo pardoned the complimentary pun on his name, but rejected the interpretation. He gave his own in 4 lines that are the most revealing in his poetry. Dear is my sleep, but more to be mere stone, so long as ruin and dishonor reign. To see naught, to feel naught, is my great gain. Then wake me not, speak in an undertone. 11. The End of an Age, 1528 to 1534. Clement did not die until he had made one more reversal of policy and had crowned his disasters by losing England for the Church in 1531. The spread of the Lutheran revolt in Germany had created for Charles V difficulties and dangers that might, he hoped, be eased by a general council. He urged this upon the Pope and was angered by repeated excuses and delays. Irritated in turn by the emperor's award of Reggio and Modena to Ferrara, Clement veered again toward France. He accepted a proposal of Francis that Caterina de' Medici should marry the king's second son Henry, and he signed secret articles binding himself to help Francis recover Milan and Genoa in 1531. At a second conference in Bologna in 1532 between Pope and Emperor, Charles again proposed a general council at which Catholics and Protestants might meet and find some formula of reconciliation. He was again rebuffed. He suggested a marriage of Catherine with Francesco Maria Sforza, imperial vicar in Milan. He found that the proposal came too late. Catherine was already sold. On October 12, 1533, Clement met Francis at Marseille and there married his niece to Henry, Duke of Orleans. It was a prime defect of the Medici as popes that they thought of themselves as a royal dynasty and sometimes rated the glory of their family above the fate of Italy or the Church. Clement tried to persuade Francis to make peace with Charles. Francis refused, and had the audacity to ask papal acquiescence to a temporary alliance of France with the Protestants and the Turks against the emperor. Clement thought that this was going a bit too far. Under the circumstances, says Pastor, it must be considered fortunate for the Church that the Pope's days were numbered. He had already lived too long. At his accession, Henry VIII was still defensor fidei, defender of the Orthodox faith against Luther, and the Protestant revolt had as yet proposed no vital doctrinal changes, but only such ecclesiastical reforms as the Council of Trent would legislate for the Church in the next generation. At Clement's death, on September 25, 1534, England, Denmark, Sweden, half of Germany, part of Switzerland, had definitely broken away from the Church, and Italy had submitted to a Spanish domination fatal to the free thought and life that had, for good or evil, marked the Renaissance. It was beyond doubt the most disastrous pontificate in the history of the Church. Everyone had rejoiced at Clement's accession. Everyone rejoiced at his death. And the rabble of Rome repeatedly defiled his tomb. Book 6, Finale, 1534 to 1576. Chapter 22, Sunset in Venice, 1534 to 1576. 1. Venice Reborn. It is something of a mystery that this age of thraldom and decline for the rest of Italy was for Venice a golden age. She had suffered severely from the wars of the League of Cambrai. She had lost many of her eastern possessions to the Turks. Her trade with the eastern Mediterranean was repeatedly disturbed with war and piracy. Her commerce with India was passing to Portugal. Why, then, could she support in this period architects like Sansovino and Palladio, writers like Aretino, painters like Titian, Tintoretto, and Veronese? In this same age, Andrea Gabrielli played the organ and led the choirs at San Marco and wrote madrigals that sounded through Italy. Music was a pampered passion of rich and poor. The palaces on the Grand Canal were rivaled in interior luxury and art only by those of bankers and cardinals in Rome. 100 poets recited their verses in booths and taverns and public squares. A dozen companies of players performed comedies. Permanent theaters were built, and Vittoria Piissimi, La Bella Maga d'Amore, the lovely sorceress of love, was the toast of the city as an actress, singer, and dancer, as women replaced boys in female parts, and the reign of divas began. Only the lamest explanation of the mystery will be given here. Though deeply injured by war, Venice had never been invaded. Her homes and shops remained intact. She had recovered her mainland possessions, and included populous cities like Padua, Vicenza, and Verona among her tributaries in education, economy, and genius. Colombo and Cornaro at Padua, Palladio at Vicenza, Veronese from Verona. She still dominated large areas of trade in and near the Adriatic. Her leading families had still unspent treasures of nursed and inherited wealth. Old industries continued to flourish and found new markets in Christendom. It was now, for example, that Venetian glass reached its tenuous crystalline perfection. The Venetian leadership in luxury products was maintained, and in this age, Venetian lace first acquired fame. Despite religious censorship, Venice still gave asylum to political refugees and to intellectual refugees like Aretino, who fumigated his hilarious ribaldries with periodical contributions to the literature of piety. Toward the end of this period, Venice twice demonstrated her civic vigor and resilience. In 1571, she took a leading part with Spain and the papacy in equipping the armada of 200 vessels that destroyed a Turkish fleet of 224 ships off Lepanto in the Gulf of Corinth. That victory, which may have saved Western Europe for Christendom, was celebrated by Venice with 3 days of mad rejoicing. The region of the Rialto was hung with cloths of turquoise or gold. Every window made the canals colorful with flags or tapestries. A great triumphal arch rose at the Rialto Bridge, and paintings by the Bellini, Giorgione, Titian, and Michelangelo were displayed in the streets. The subsequent carnival was the wildest that Venice had ever known, setting the pace for many later carnivals. Everyone masked and frolicked, laying a moratorium upon morality, and clowns like Pantalone and Zani, that is Johnny, gave their names to a dozen languages. And then, in 1574 and 1577, tragic fires in the ducal palace gutted several rooms. Paintings by Gentile da Fabriano, the Bellini, the Vivarini, Titian, Pordenone, Tintoretto, and Veronese were destroyed. In 2 days, the labor and art of a century disappeared. The spirit of the Republic shone out in the rapidity and resolution with which the damaged interiors were restored. Giovanni da Ponte was commissioned to rebuild the chambers on their former lines. Cristoforo Sorte designed in 29 divisions the marvelous ceiling of the Sala del Maggior Consiglio. And the walls were painted by Tintoretto, Veronese, Palma Giovane, and Francesco Bassano. In other rooms, the Collegio, or meeting place of the Doge and his council, the Anticollegio, or antechamber, the Sala dei Pregadi, or Senate Hall, ceilings and doors and windows were designed by the greatest architects of the age: Jacopo Sansovino, Palladio, Antonio Scarpagnino, Alessandro Vittoria. Jacopo d'Antonio di Jacopo Tatti was by birth, in 1486, a Florentine. This book is continued on Cassette 10, Side 1.